Hi everybody, this is Anne. One of the most difficult parts of painting on pottery is choosing your own personal palette of colors. Then, understanding how those colors relate to each other so they can be used to create harmonies and pleasing balances. One fail-proof exercise to encourage you to develop those skills is by doing an exercise I bet you used to do as a kid. That is, to utilize the coloring book method. In this video, I'll show you several ways to do it. You can obtain the bulky outlined coloring book images in books or even just images from the internet. Here's a flowery one that I printed out. To transfer it to my clay, I'll use black underglaze and a small fingernail detailer brush. I simply dip the brush in the underglaze, then brush it straight over the lines that I want to transfer down. One tip is to only outline the borders of the images, leaving the inner detail lines until later. I let the underglaze dry totally, and I rolled out a fresh slab. I ribbed the slab smooth. For this demonstration, I only outlined a few of the flowers for you, the darker ones there in the center. I turned the paper over and set it on the clay. Starting in the center, I began to wet the paper with a damp sponge. The underglaze will become re-wetted, and it'll stick to the moist clay slab. Then you can peel up the paper. There will probably be some areas that'll need to be cleaned up a bit. I used a needle tool to gently scrape off any bits of stray underglaze or stuck paper. If there are any lines that didn't transfer, you can manually paint those in. Once the underglaze dried, I placed my template down and cut around it. To make a plate with this, I placed the slab down on a piece of thick foam, centered the mold over the slab, then pushed down on it. Now here's one that I completed earlier, where the plate is now bone dry. Now for the fun part of filling in the spaces with color. I'm going to work light to dark, starting with the Amico blush. I brushed all of the flower petals with a solid coat of that underglaze. You'll notice that I use more dabs of thick underglaze than real brushing. I like a thick application, and the dabs leave that thicker layer so it stays wetter longer. Next, I dabbed into the wet blush a thinned down bright red underglaze along the bottom edges of each petal. To blend and soften the harsh line between the colors, I added a touch more of the wet blush. The blush makes the rose look so cold, I used just a touch of the intense yellow at the top of each petal right into the wet blush. The yellow is subtle, yet it adds so much warmth. Continuing with the yellow, I dabbed it into one of the leaf shapes. While it was wet, I dabbed just a touch of the watered-down electric blue to the bottom edge of the leaf and mixed it into the yellow so they combined to create a mottled green. I continued this with all the surrounding leaf shapes. As the brush gets saturated with differing proportions of the blue and the yellow, you can see that each leaf will be distinct. Variety is always good. I'll continue to fill in each shape with the same combination of colors. The painting will go fast as you try and work wet into wet. One other tip is to use different proportions of the blush, the red, and the yellow in each of the flower shapes too. Again, each flower will have its own distinct look, which will make for a more interesting composition. Finally, now I can go in with my small brush into the black underglaze and fill in all those small detail lines that were in the original picture. Now here's a plate that I finished earlier with all the images filled in and the details added. I bisque fired it, then added opulence wildflower glaze around the border and white liner glaze around the flowers for this springy plate. This time, let's start with a full color design like on this tissue paper, and instead of painting the black outlines like before, I'll paint the colors. I laid a block of the paper down on a bat so I could move it around easier once the underglaze was on it. I don't have the exact colors to mimic the tissue paper, but I'm not trying to make an exact copy of the design either. You'll see that it really doesn't matter if you match the exact colors. I started with the blush and began to paint loosely around each of the rose flowers. I'm being as generous with the amount of underglaze that I'm using so I get a thick coat onto the paper. While the underglaze was still wet, I switched to the bright red and filled in the centers, and also painted some of the blush areas with the red as well, so it blended to create a deeper pink color. Some of the flowers were more orange, so I started with the yellow and painted those peachy roses, plus any other little areas in the leaf sections that looked like yellow highlights. I then started adding baby blue to the leafy areas, sometimes blending the baby blue into the yellow leafy sections. This will create a cool blue-green color. I also added just a little of the electric blue on the darker leaves, but not a lot. Now remember to leave it as a washy, loose design. I set that aside to dry completely. To transfer it, I started with a freshly rolled 1/4-inch slab and placed the painting on it face down. Starting in the center, I used a moist sponge to wet the back of the paper and re-moisten the underglaze so it'll transfer down. I checked under a corner to make sure it was transferred, then peeled away the paper. Don't worry if some of the paper rips at this point. Just carefully pick it off with a needle tool or your fingernails like I did. Here's the loose image that I was hoping to achieve. While the clay is still bendable, I'll go ahead and construct my plate. Using a hexagon mold, I cut around the back side of the mold and removed the excess clay. I placed the clay on a thick piece of foam, centered the mold, then pushed the mold down on top of the clay to form this plate. Now I'm going to add another layer over the design, so it's important for me to let that plate dry to leather hard before transferring anything else. I had this adult coloring book with lots of bulky fun shapes. One of the pages has these funky birds. I cut the birds from the page so they'd fit on my plate. Like the first project, I painted black over all the outlines, then let that dry completely. I then transferred them down to the plate and flooded the area with solid coats of underglaze to achieve this fun piece. To finish it, I glazed over the very outer part with the Spectrum Wildflower glaze. I coated the rest with Amico C11 clear glaze for this nice shiny finish. If you're feeling intimidated to lay down your colors like in the last project, the perfect solution is to go back a little farther in your childhood and finger paint. Start with a blank piece of paper. I used mulberry paper, but a thicker paper would have been better, which you'll see. I poured some blush at the top, intense red in the middle, and bright yellow at the bottom, and started swirling them around, making sure each color mixed together and created swirls. As the underglaze mixed together, all my red disappeared, so I added a bit more red to the center and swirled that in. I let that dry completely. Here are some other sheets that I made previously and let dry. My next step is to cut flower shapes from the underglaze sheets. Now I don't have to worry if the colors I'm adding will be the right color. I can choose what colors I want from the sheets. I'm not really cutting specific flower shapes either. I'm basically cutting random circular and petal shapes from the colors that I like and simple canoe shapes for the leaves. Again, I rolled out a fresh slab and lightly traced the plate mold over the clay so I know where the boundaries are that I'll be working in. I began to place my shapes around the plate. I then took my moist sponge and moistened the back of the paper. When the underglaze was transferred, I peeled the paper away. You can see that the mulberry paper was a bit too thin, so I had to work a bit with my X-Acto to get all the paper peeled up. Printer paper would have been the better choice. But I finally got the job done. Don't worry if some of the color didn't transfer. It actually adds character, as you'll see after our next step. To finish off our coloring book look, the design needs the black outlines. On this yellow flower, I started with a swirl in the very center. I then began to section off petal shapes like I was looking straight down into the center of it. On this second flower, I started with half-moon shapes, then kept finishing it with petal shapes around the outer edges. I outlined the canoe shapes, then added vein lines to each leaf. Some of the flowers I did simple daisy petal designs. You can see the design really start to come to life. Here's a plate I made earlier with the same underglaze sheets, just with more variety of flower and leaf shapes. To glaze it, I painted bright red underglaze around the rim, then glazed over that with weeping plum. I used my white liner glaze to glaze around all the flowers and leaves, then high-fired it to cone 5 with an 8-minute hold. I'm hoping that at least one of these underglaze techniques will give you the courage to start painting and develop your own underglaze palette of colors. Thanks to the newest members of our Little Street Pottery Research Facility team. If you'd like to join the team and earn a title, click on the Super Thanks button or the link to buy me a coffee. In any case, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you next time in the studio. Now, I had this adult coloring book. Let me do that again.